What if giving away your last $10 to a stranger in the rain became the moment that changed your life forever? Meet Grace, a young woman who lost everything, until one quiet act of compassion set off a chain of miracles she never saw coming. From park benches to purpose, from hopelessness to love, her story will move you, heal you, and remind you that kindness is never wasted. You won't believe who that stranger really was. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more soul-stirring stories that prove your story matters too. The train station was nearly deserted, blanketed in the soft hush of a late November morning, the kind that carried a bite in the air and the scent of damp leaves. Grace Holden stood under the awning near track 4, her coat wrapped tightly around her frame, though it did little to keep out the cold that settled deep in her bones. Her breath came out in pale clouds, and her fingers, red and stiff, fumbled with the edge of a crumpled train ticket she had checked 3 times already. It wasn't just a ticket. It wasn't just a ticket. It was her last thread of hope. A job interview across town for a position she wasn't even sure she was qualified for. But it was something. And something. And something, at this point, was everything. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to stay warm, her stomach a hollow echo from skipping breakfast. Her wallet contained a single $10 bill, tucked carefully into a zippered pocket. It was meant for a cheap meal after the interview, a sandwich maybe, something to remind her she was still human. That $10 was her safety net, thin as it was, the final remnant of a life that had unraveled far too quickly. "Excuse me." The voice was soft, hesitant, almost drowned by the hiss of a train pulling away in the distance. Grace turned her head and saw him, mid to late 20s, soaking wet despite the overhang, with a thin jacket clinging to his frame and hair plastered to his forehead. He had a beard that looked grown out from neglect, not style, and eyes, blue and bloodshot, that met hers with a strange kind of vulnerability. Not desperation, not quite. Something quieter, sadder. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, voice rough. "I had my wallet stolen. I need $10 for a train ticket to get home. I swear I'll pay you back. If you could just trust me." For a second, Grace said nothing. Her fingers curled around the inside of her coat, feeling the edge of that $10 bill like it was a lifeline. This had to be a joke. Who asked strangers for exact change these days? And why her? She was barely keeping herself together. Giving that money away meant no lunch, no emergency backup, nothing. Just blind faith. She looked him over again. He was shivering, lips pale, hands red with cold. His shoes looked a size too big and badly worn. But there was something in his expression that caught her off guard. No slick performance, no smirk. He looked embarrassed to even be asking. "Do you have anyone you can call?" she asked, skeptical. He shook his head, glancing down. "Phone's dead. I tried asking people, but no one would talk. I get it. I wouldn't believe me either." Grace narrowed her eyes.
"How do I know you're not lying?"
"You don't," he said simply. "I could be. I'm not. But I get that it sounds crazy." The station fell silent for a moment, except for the distant screech of steel and the rush of wind through the rafters. Grace's heart thudded in her chest. She wanted to walk away. She should walk away. But something deeper held her back. A memory, maybe. The version of herself before everything fell apart. The version that still believed in helping, in hope. She slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out the $10 bill. It looked smaller now in her hand, flimsier, like a piece of herself being torn away. "I don't know why," she said softly, "but I believe you." He looked at the bill like it was a miracle. Carefully, he took it, as if afraid it might disappear. "I promise," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I'll pay you back." "Just get home safe," she replied, offering a small, tired smile. The train pulled in behind them, steam rising around its wheels as it hissed to a stop. He gave her one last look, nodded, and then turned aboard. A moment later, he was gone, lost in the crowd. Grace stood still, her hands colder now than before, her stomach twisting. She didn't even know his name. Just like that, her last $10 vanished into the fog of morning and a stranger's promise. Her train arrived moments later. She climbed aboard with damp cuffs and weary steps, sank into a seat by the window, and watched the platform disappear behind her. She didn't know it then, but that simple act of kindness, the decision to give away everything she had left, was the moment her life began to change. The morning had shifted from mist to drizzle by the time Grace stepped off the train. The city smelled like wet asphalt and distant exhaust, and her thin-soled shoes soaked through within minutes of hitting the sidewalk. She checked the time. Already 10:15. The interview was scheduled for 10 sharp. Her stomach sank, a hollow weight settling beneath her ribs. She picked up her pace, weaving through crowded streets and puddles, ignoring the cold that gnawed at her ankles and the ache building in her legs. The bus route she had planned to take had changed without notice, and with no coins for fare, she had tried to walk the remaining 9 blocks. The city, sprawling and unfamiliar, didn't care that she was late. It swallowed her up in its noise, its hurry, its indifference. By the time she reached the building, tall glass framed by steel and ambition, her coat was soaked through and her hair clung to her face in damp strands. She stepped into the lobby breathless and pale, her cheeks tinged pink from the wind. The receptionist glanced up, her expression politely detached. "May I help you?" Grace stepped forward, hands wringing the strap of her worn purse. I had an interview with Mr. Lansing for the assistant position. I'm sorry I'm late. The bus." The woman was already shaking her head. "Schedule Lansing had another meeting scheduled. I'm afraid you'll have to reschedule." "I can wait," Grace offered quickly, desperation creeping into her voice, "even if it's just 10 minutes. Please." The receptionist returned her gaze to the screen, her voice cool and final. "You'll need to call and book a new appointment." The conversation ended there, like a slammed door. Grace stood still for a moment, the weight of disappointment pressing on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She turned slowly and walked back out into the rain. It felt colder now, meaner. By the time she reached her tiny rented room on the edge of downtown, her socks made squelching sounds with every step. She climbed the cracked stairs to the second floor, already rehearsing an apology to her landlord in her mind. Maybe she could promise an extra 20 next week. Explain that a job was coming, just delayed. But when she turned the corner, he was already there. "Mr. Dorsey," arms crossed, eyes tired. "Grace," he said, not unkindly, "rent was due 3 days ago." "I know. I almost had it. I need until Friday." "You said that last week." She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. There was no argument to be made, just excuses. The kind even she was tired of hearing. "I've got someone else who's interested in the room," he said more softly. "I'm sorry." She didn't plead. What was the point? Instead, she stepped inside, packed what little she had, 2 changes of clothes, a cracked phone with no service, a battered copy of a novel her mother once read to her. She stuffed it all into an old backpack, zipped it shut, and left the key on the kitchen counter. That night, She found herself at the public library again, the one that never truly slept. She curled into a corner behind the nonfiction shelves and tried to disappear. The security guard passed by twice before finally asking her to leave, so she did. The park benches were slick and cruel. The wind stung through every layer she wore. She hugged her backpack to her chest and watched the city go quiet, the sky hanging low and gray. She didn't sleep, not really. The next day bled into the next. The ache in her stomach became familiar, almost companionable. She drifted between shelters and job boards, where forms asked for a phone number, a permanent address, a reference. She had none. She watched people walk by with headphones in, coffee cups warm in their hands, laughter rising like steam. They didn't see her. She wasn't even invisible. She wasn't even invisible. She was less than that. Forgotten. One evening, as the sun dipped low and golden against the buildings, a group of teenagers passed her near the park. One of them tossed an empty soda can near her feet and muttered, "Get a job." She didn't flinch, just pulled her coat tighter and turned away. That night, she returned to the library. The doors were locked. A holiday. So she wandered until her legs gave out and curled up inside a bus shelter, arms wrapped tight around herself, breath fog in the glass. She didn't sob. She didn't scream. She just let the tears slip silently down her cheeks, disappearing into the collar of her coat. She missed her mother's voice, the warmth of it, the way she used to say Grace's name like it meant something. She missed being held, being known. When the sun rose, it found her still there, crumpled and hollow and tired beyond words, but still breathing, somehow still breathing. The Tuesday morning air was brittle with frost, the kind that lingered even after the sun had technically risen. Grace sat curled on her usual bench in the park, the one near the statue of a long-forgotten war general whose name had worn away with time. Her knees were drawn tightly to her chest, arms wrapped around them, her coat zipped all the way up, though it barely held back the cold. Her stomach had been empty for almost 2 days. The hunger wasn't sharp anymore. It had dulled into something constant and low, like static humming in the background of her mind. She had almost stopped noticing it. Almost stopped noticing it. She blinked up at the gray sky, wishing she could sink into it and vanish. Around her, the park moved in slow motion. Joggers in thermal gear passed by without looking. A woman walked a poodle wearing a raincoat that probably cost more than Grace had spent on food in the last month. She watched the world carry on, brisk and intact, while she sat there, unraveling. Then came a rustle. Not the wind, not footsteps. Softer, intentional. She looked up. A woman, older, maybe in her 70s, was walking slowly toward her, her boots crunching on the gravel path. She wore a long wool shawl that trailed behind her like something out of a storybook, and her gloved hands held a small brown paper bag. Her steps were careful but certain, as though she knew exactly where she was going. And when she reached Grace's bench, she didn't hesitate. She stopped, tilted her head slightly, and said in a voice that was low, calm, and impossibly kind, "You look hungry." Grace blinked, caught off guard. Her first instinct was defensiveness. She braced herself for pity or scolding or the offer of pamphlets she'd seen too many times. "I'm fine," she murmured quickly, automatically. But the woman didn't move away. She sat down beside her without asking permission and placed the paper bag on the bench between them. "I bring extra every morning," the woman said, unwrapping the bag with careful fingers. "In case I run into someone who might need it." Grace looked down. Inside was a sandwich. Thick slices of soft bread, ham, and cheese, a smudge of mustard at the edge. Fresh, real. Her stomach twisted in response. "I can't take that," she whispered, ashamed of how badly she wanted to. Why not? The woman asked gently. Is your pride bigger than your hunger? Grace flushed and looked away. It wasn't pride. It was something harder to explain. The fear of needing too much, of being seen as someone who couldn't stand on their own. But the woman didn't push. She waited, quiet and steady, her presence as warm as the shawl wrapped around her. Eventually, Grace reached for the sandwich, hands trembling slightly. She unwrapped it slowly, carefully, as though afraid it might vanish if she moved too quickly. The first bite nearly undid her. She chewed slowly, blinking against the sudden sting in her eyes. She managed, the words thick with the lump in her throat. The woman smiled. There's a soup kitchen on Monroe Street, just a few blocks from here. They serve lunch every day. They're always short on help. She paused. You look like someone who could use both, a warm place and a purpose. Grace looked at her, unsure if she was being tested or offered something real. You think they'd let me volunteer? Ask for Clarice, the woman said, standing with surprising grace. Tell her Marta sent you. She walked away before Grace could say anything else. Her shawl caught the wind behind her, and then she was gone, swallowed by the morning mist. Grace sat there for a long while, finishing the sandwich in silence. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she'd eaten something made with care. Her hands rested in her lap, still cradling the crumpled wrapping, like it meant something more than just lunch. She whispered the name to herself, Clarice. Monroe Street, Marta. Later that afternoon, driven more by curiosity than certainty, she found herself walking the narrow sidewalks of a quieter part of town. There, nestled between a laundromat and an old corner church, stood a faded brick building with a painted sign. Hearth. She paused, heart fluttering with nerves. She hadn't stepped through a real doorway in days. But she reached for the handle anyway. And with that, something shifted. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But just enough to remind her that maybe, just maybe, things could still change. The door creaked open with a groan that echoed into the hallway. Inside, the air was warm and carried the scent of something rich and savory. Maybe soup, maybe cornbread. Grace stepped across the threshold slowly, unsure of where to look or what to say. The space was modest, but welcoming. A handful of long tables set with mismatched chairs, chipped ceramic bowls stacked near the serving counter, and people moving briskly between the kitchen and the dining area. There was a hum of activity that reminded her of a beehive, chaotic but full of purpose. A woman stood near the back, clipboard in hand, sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She was in her 50s, maybe older, her hair pulled into a tight bun, streaked with silver. Her expression was sharp but not unkind, like someone who'd seen enough to know when someone needed a break, and when someone was bluffing. Grace hesitated, hovering near the doorway. Then, summoning the fragile thread of courage she still had, she stepped forward and cleared her throat. Hi, she said, her voice thinner than she meant it to be. Someone named Marta told me to come here. She said I should ask for Clarice. The woman looked up from her clipboard, eyes narrowing slightly. You Grace? She asked, not unkindly. Grace blinked. How did you... Marta has a gift for spotting the right people, Clarice said, setting the clipboard aside. She called me this morning, said you might stop by. Grace didn't know what to say to that. Her mind was still spinning from how quickly things seemed to be shifting. One morning she was curled up in a bus shelter. Now she was standing in a real kitchen with someone expecting her. I don't have experience, she blurted. I mean, not in places like this. But I can learn. I'm not afraid of work. Clarice raised an eyebrow. You willing to wash dishes? Grace nodded. Peel potatoes? Yes. Take orders from someone half your size with twice your volume? A hesitant smile flickered on Grace's lips. Sounds like a challenge I'm willing to accept. Clarice studied her for another second, then nodded. Then grab an apron. The next few hours passed in a blur. Grace was handed a threadbare white apron that smelled faintly of bleach and oregano. She chopped carrots, rinsed lettuce, wiped down sticky tables, and ladled soup into bowls so hot the steam blurred her glasses. At first, her movements were hesitant, stilted. But with each task completed, her body seemed to remember what it meant to have a rhythm again, a purpose. She watched the guests come through the line, some quiet, others cheerful, many grateful. There were older men with hunched backs and calloused hands, young mothers balancing toddlers on one hip, and trays in the other, teenagers with guarded eyes who barely spoke at all, and every one of them said, "Thank you." Some even smiled. One man cracked jokes with the other guests, his laughter booming through the dining room like a welcome bell. A little girl with tangled curls and a worn-out hoodie handed Grace a drawing made from a torn notebook page. Just a flower, uneven and bright and lovely in its simplicity. Grace smiled so wide her cheeks hurt. By the end of her shift, her arms ached and her feet throbbed, but she felt lighter than she had in weeks. She didn't want to leave. As she was wiping down the last table, Clarice approached her with a folded envelope in hand. "It's not much," she said, handing it over. "A small stipend. You've earned it." Grace hesitated. "I wasn't doing this for money." "I know," Clarice replied, her voice gentler now. "That's why you deserve it." Inside the envelope was a crisp $20 bill. Not just money. Bus fare, a hot meal, a little space to breathe. But more than that, it was validation. Proof that she had contributed, that she mattered, that she wasn't invisible. That night, Grace sat on the curb outside Second Hearth, the orange glow of the setting sun warming the pavement beneath her. The sounds of the kitchen faded behind her, replaced by the quiet hum of the city shifting into evening. In her hand, she held the envelope, and in her heart, a quiet flicker of hope had begun to burn. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would look like. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she wanted to find out. Grace came back the next day, and the day after that. She wasn't sure why at first. Maybe it was the warmth, or the scent of soup simmering in the back kitchen that reminded her of the Sundays her mother used to cook something from scratch. Or maybe it was the way Clarice nodded at her when she walked through the door like she belonged. But more than anything, it was the work. Peeling potatoes, stacking bowls, listening to the laughter rise up from tables she once would have avoided out of fear or pride. It gave her hands something to do and her heart somewhere to land. Each shift blurred into the next, not in monotony, but in rhythm. Grace learned the regulars by name. Mr. Leonard, who quoted poetry while he ate his stew. Denise, who always asked for extra bread rolls and gave one away without fail. Maria, who wore the same polka dot scarf every Thursday and insisted on calling Grace Sunshine. Grace started remembering things, too, which guests liked their soup a little thinner, who needed someone to talk to, and who just needed silence. She became a part of it, not just a helper, but a thread in the fabric of the place. Clarice never made a big deal out of her sticking around. She handed her tasks like a sergeant, barked at her when she scrubbed pans too gently, and praised her with a simple nod or grunt. But one afternoon, when the lunch rush had calmed and the volunteers were cleaning up, Clarice pressed another envelope into her hand. "Still not doing this for the money?" she asked, half smirking. Grace shook her head, smiling. "But I won't say no to it either." Clarice nodded approvingly. That's the spirit. New side was another 20. Enough for a few days of food, maybe even a thrift store sweater to replace the one with fraying cuffs. But it wasn't the cash that made Grace's throat tighten. It was the quiet trust behind it, the way Clarice didn't question whether she deserved it. Later that evening, as Grace walked home, though home was still a rotating series of borrowed spaces, she passed by a gas station and stopped to warm her hands near the vending machines. She watched cars go by, their headlights streaking across puddles, and felt, for the first time in weeks, like she wasn't just surviving. She was rebuilding, slowly, clumsily, but moving forward. By the end of her first full week at Second Hearth, Grace no longer checked her reflection in store windows to see if she looked too lost to be trusted. She stood taller. She laughed more. Even Clarice noticed. "You're not dragging your feet as much," she remarked one morning. "I guess they're not so heavy anymore," Grace said. The two shared a glance, a flicker of mutual understanding that needed no further words. One day, as Grace was wiping down a table near the back, a little boy darted up to her, breathless and grinning, holding a broken toy truck in one hand and a crayon drawing in the other. "This is for you," he declared, thrusting the paper into her hands. It was a mess of color, swirls of blue, orange, and green. In the middle, two stick figures stood holding hands under what looked like a giant smiling sun. Grace's name was scribbled in uneven letters beneath it. She looked up at the boy, stunned. "Why me?" "'Cause you smile at my mom when she's sad," he said simply, before turning and sprinting away. Grace stared at the drawing for a long moment, then folded it carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of her coat. She wasn't just helping. She was seen. She was remembered. That night, as the kitchen lights dimmed and the hum of the dishwasher wound down to a quiet click, Grace sat alone on the back steps, sipping tea someone had forgotten to drink. The air was crisp, the stars distant but clear. She thought of where she'd been just 10 days ago, hollow, invisible, floating without an anchor. And now, here she was, with calloused hands and aching feet, and something resembling hope swelling in her chest. She closed her eyes and whispered softly to herself, "Maybe this is what starting over looks like." And for the first time, it didn't feel like an impossible dream. It felt real. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon at Second Hearth, the kind of slow day where the scent of tomato stew still lingered in the air, and the last of the lunch dishes were stacked neatly to dry. Grace was humming softly under her breath as she wiped down the long wooden table closest to the window. The late sunlight spilled in warm slants through the dusty blinds, dancing on the floor in lazy patterns. She liked this part of the day, the calm after the wave, the quiet where her thoughts could settle. She was just reaching for the spray bottle when the front door creaked open and the small bell above it jingled. Grace looked up, expecting a regular or maybe a new guest wandering in for coffee, but the man who stepped through the doorway didn't fit either picture. He was tall, wearing a sharply tailored charcoal coat that practically announced he didn't belong in this part of town. His shoes gleamed. His hair was neatly combed, swept back in a way that suggested confidence, not vanity. He carried himself like someone used to being noticed, and yet, when he looked around the room, it wasn't with arrogance. It was with curiosity, and something else. Recognition. Their eyes locked. Grace's heart skipped once, then again. He froze just inside the door, his expression shifting ever so slightly, calm but stunned, as if he hadn't expected to find what he was looking for. She stared, mouth parting slightly. That face, the eyes, blue, steady, familiar, but it couldn't be. He wasn't. "Hello," he said, taking a step forward. His voice, that voice. Grace's throat tightened. Do I know you?" He smiled just a little. "You do. Or at least, you once trusted me when no one else would." And it clicked. Just like that. The rain. The train station. The $10 bill. Her last $10. You, she whispered. He nodded. Julian West. She blinked, almost swaying with the force of the realization. You clean up well, she said, half laughing, half breathless. Julian grinned. I had help. Turned out a hot shower and a change of clothes go a long way. Grace folded her arms across her apron, still trying to understand what was happening. I never even knew your name. You just disappeared. I came back, he said quickly, stepping closer. The next day, but you were gone. I asked the woman at the ticket counter, searched the platform, even waited a few hours in case you came back. But no one knew anything. I didn't even know your name. She studied him closely. What are you doing here? At Second Hearth? I was passing through the neighborhood, he said. I saw the sign, and I don't know. Something told me to come in. I didn't expect to find you. Not really. But I hoped. She looked around the empty dining room, the mop bucket in the corner, the chip bowls stacked near the sink. Well, you found me. This is where I've been. He glanced around too, his eyes softening. You work here? I volunteer, she said. Helps keep my head above water. Julian's expression changed then, not pity, not guilt, but something deeper. Respect. You helped me when I had nothing, he said. I'd like to return the favor. She shook her head immediately. That's not why I gave you the money. I know, he said. That's exactly why I want to. They stood there for a moment, caught in the odd stillness of their reunion. Then Julian reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a crisp $10 bill. He held it out to her. To pay you back, he said. It's been in my wallet ever since. Grace stared at it, then laughed softly. She reached out and took it, their fingers brushing. Thank you, she said quietly, 1,000 unsaid thoughts swirling behind her eyes. Julian wasn't done. I was hoping, he continued, his voice gentler now, that maybe you'd let me buy you a coffee sometime. Or dinner. Something simple. I haven't forgotten that day. Or you. Grace looked at him, this man who had once been soaked to the bone and trembling with cold, now standing in a pressed coat and polished shoes, asking to see her again. Everything about it felt surreal, but in the best way. You're really not who I thought you were, she murmured. No, he said with a quiet smile, I'm not. And for the first time, she realized, neither was she. They sat across from each other in a cozy cafe just a few blocks from Second Hearth. The kind with mismatched chairs, foggy windows, and the smell of cinnamon lingering in the air. Grace still wore her apron beneath her coat, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of chamomile tea. She hadn't had anything this comforting in weeks. Julian, sitting opposite her, stirred his coffee slowly, as if building up to something. You're probably wondering who I really am, he said, his voice soft but clear. Grace gave a small, careful smile. Well, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a sleek black card. He slid it across the table to her. She hesitated before picking it up, reading the bold silver letters. Julian West, CEO, Novaries Technologies, founder, Westbridge Foundation. She blinked. Novaries, that's your company? He nodded. Started it 10 years ago. We build adaptive learning software and digital platforms for education access. We've got programs in over 100 cities now. Grace's mouth opened, then closed. She remembered Novaries. There had been a feature about it on the news at the shelter once. Something about reshaping education for underfunded schools. She hadn't connected it to the man she gave $10 to in a rainstorm. But that day, you were doing something stupid? Julian finished with a self-deprecating grin. I was working on a campaign for the Westbridge Foundation, our nonprofit arm. One of our initiatives focuses on homelessness and reintegration. I wanted to understand it better. I thought if I went undercover for a few days, no wallet, no I'd, I'd gain some kind of perspective. He paused, shaking his head. What I didn't plan for was getting my pocket picked on the first day. Suddenly, I was actually stranded. And no one would help. People looked right through me. Grace sat quietly, letting the truth settle over her. The disbelief, the strange irony. "Except you," Julian said, his eyes meeting hers again. "You didn't ask for anything. You didn't judge me. You just helped." She looked down at her tea, fingers tightening around the mug. "I thought I was being naive." That I was just making a mistake. "You weren't," he said firmly. "You were being human." There was something in his voice that made her chest tighten. It wasn't just gratitude. It was reverence. "I never forgot you," he went on. "I tried to find you, asked around the station, the coffee stand, even checked shelters. No one knew your name. You disappeared." "I didn't mean to," Grace whispered. "Everything just got worse after that. I lost the room I was renting, missed the interview. I didn't have anything left." Julian leaned forward slightly. "That's why I want to offer you something, if you're open to it." She met his eyes, cautious. "I want you to work with us," he said. "Not at Novarees, but at the Westbridge Foundation. We have programs focused on outreach, micro-entrepreneurship, and transitional services. But we need people like you, people with heart. With lived experience, people who understand what it means to fall and get back up." Grace blinked, stunned. Her first instinct was to laugh, but the earnestness in his voice kept her still. "I don't have a degree," she said quietly. "I don't even have a permanent address right now." Julian didn't flinch. "We've hired people with Ivy League diplomas and people who lived in tents for a year. What matters is your story, your resilience, your willingness to help someone else, even when you had nothing yourself." She sat back in her chair, overwhelmed. Her life had been a constant chain of slammed doors and cold nights. And now, here was someone prying open a window wide enough to climb through. "You really mean it?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't," Julian said, his voice quiet but steady. "You'd start with training, shadowing. We'd help you get settled somewhere safe. Then you'd work with one of our community teams. Eventually, maybe even lead one." Grace stared at him, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on her, but something new rising beneath it. Something lighter. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. He smiled. "Say yes." She looked at him, the stranger she had once helped, now offering her a future she thought was lost. And then, after a breath, she said it. "Yeah. Yes." Grace's first day at the Westbridge Foundation felt like stepping into an entirely different reality, one with exposed brick walls, glass, paneled conference rooms, and a quiet buzz of purpose that hummed in the air like electricity. The headquarters was housed inside a renovated warehouse downtown, transformed into a space filled with warm light, plants that weren't plastic, and murals on every wall. The people moved quickly, but not frantically. Laughter and collaboration drifted from open workstations, where groups huddled around laptops and sketchpads. It was a world she'd only seen from the outside, through windows she never thought she'd walk past, let alone enter. Julian met her in the lobby. Not with fanfare. Not with a speech. but with a small smile and a paper cup of tea. "Chamomile," he said, "in case your nerves are staging a coup." Grace smiled. Her fingers brushing his, she took the cup. "They are. But thank you." He led her through the space, introducing her to staff as if she were already part of the team. "This is Grace Halden," he'd say. "She brings insight and experience we need more of around here." Not once did he use the words formerly homeless or soup kitchen volunteer. He didn't define her by where she had come from, but by what she could offer. That alone unraveled something in her. She was placed in a small onboarding group, 3 others, all coming from different walks of life. A woman who had been working in addiction recovery, a young man who grew up in the foster system and had started his own grassroots initiative, and an older ex-construction worker with a limp and a gift for storytelling. Together, they started learning the ropes: how to design outreach proposals, coordinate food distribution, write mini-grants, build strategic partnerships. Grace took it all in like dry earth drinking rain. It wasn't always easy. The language was new. The pace, fast. She stumbled over terminology and doubted herself every hour. But no one made her feel small for it. And every day, something in her got a little stronger. Julian checked in often, but never hovered. He offered suggestions, encouragement, and the occasional sarcastic remark to cut through the tension. "If you can survive Clarice and her soup ladle, the rest of this is child's play," he joked once, making her laugh out loud in the middle of a planning session. Outside of the training, Grace began shadowing field coordinators. She visited youth shelters, spoke with volunteers at job placement centers, helped organize food drives and street-level support. Some of the faces she encountered looked a lot like hers had weeks ago. Tired, wary, hovering somewhere between desperation and numbness. And when she sat down beside them, she didn't need to pretend to understand. She did understand. There were moments that broke her open. A teenage girl, barely 17, asking if hope was something only other people got. A man who couldn't stop apologizing for crying when someone offered him a clean pair of socks. Grace carried those moments like pebbles in her pocket, grounding her on the hard days. And then, after several weeks of learning and listening and showing up even when she felt unsure, Julian handed her a slim folder with a quiet, almost proud expression. "Your own pilot project," he said. "Design something that matters to you. We'll support it." Grace opened the folder with trembling fingers. Inside was a blank template for a proposal, and beneath that, her name, typed in bold. She sat up straighter. "Anything. As long as it's community-driven, sustainable, and comes from the heart," Julian said, his voice gentle. And she knew immediately what it would be. A mobile soup kitchen, but not just food. A rolling haven that could go where people were. Where shame wouldn't stop them from stepping inside. Where she could serve a bowl of soup and ask a name. Offer a resource, a kind word, a bridge. She called it the Ember line, because even in the ashes of a life burned down, a single ember could spark warmth again. Julian loved it. So did the board. The proposal was greenlit. A van was purchased and repainted sky blue with the name stenciled in elegant white script. Grace cried the first time she saw it parked in the foundations lot. She ran her hand along the side, heart thudding like a drum. This was hers. Not just the van, but the mission, the purpose, the chance. That night, she stood in the driver's seat, fingers on the wheel, and whispered, "Let's go find them," because she remembered too well what it felt like to be waiting, unseen, on the other side. The Ember line launched on a cool spring morning, the kind where the sky was silver with overcast light, but the air felt clean, expectant. Grace stood beside the van in a gravel lot behind the foundation's main office. nervously adjusting her jacket as a few volunteers loaded up trays of food into the built-in warming compartments. The inside of the van was compact but beautifully designed, efficient, welcoming, and colorful, with shelving for supplies, a counter to serve from, and a small bench seat tucked in the back for conversations, quiet or otherwise. It didn't feel like a service truck. It felt like a little piece of home on wheels. As the engine turned over and the wheels rolled onto the road, Grace sat in the passenger seat, staring ahead with her heart in her throat. Their first stop was a park she knew too well. It was the place where she'd once curled into herself on a cold bench, trying to will her body to ignore hunger and fear, where the streetlights buzzed overhead and the stars seemed too far away to be real. Now she was returning not as someone forgotten, but as someone coming back with something to give. When they pulled up, a few people looked up from the benches, curious but cautious. Grace stepped out, smoothing her apron, and opened the side window. Hot soup, sandwiches, fresh fruit, she called gently. No forms, no questions, just food. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, a man in his 40s with a worn-out hoodie and wary eyes approached. Grace handed him a warm bowl with both hands and asked his name. "Eli," he muttered. "Well, Eli," she said with a smile, "you're the first customer of the Ember line." He looked at the bowl like it might disappear, then nodded once and shuffled away to sit beneath a tree. After that, more people came. Word traveled quickly. 2 sisters who hadn't eaten since yesterday. A young man with bandaged knuckles, an elderly woman who asked for just half a portion and then cried when Grace insisted she take more. It wasn't just the food. It was the way Grace spoke to them, looked them in the eye, remembered their names. She was one of them and wasn't at the same time. She'd lived it, survived it, and now she was building something that made it just a little easier for the next person. Julian showed up later that day, a paper cup of her favorite tea in hand. He didn't say anything at first, just stood to the side, watching her move from guest to guest, listening, laughing, comforting. When she finally returned to the van to grab more napkins, she spotted him leaning against the back bumper. "You came," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "Wouldn't have missed it," he replied, holding out the tea. She took it, letting their fingers brush. "She working?" she whispered. "She working?" He nodded. "I knew it would. Because you know what people really need. And you're not afraid to give it." In the weeks that followed, the Ember line expanded its route. They visited libraries, parks, abandoned gas stations, forgotten alleys. Wherever people gathered with nowhere else to go, Grace and her team showed up. The van became a symbol of warmth, of care, of something stable in a world that rarely was. But it wasn't just the guests who were changing. Grace was too. She found herself standing taller, speaking more confidently in meetings with city officials and local organizations. Her ideas weren't just heard. They were implemented. She worked with interns, trained volunteers, wrote proposals late into the night while sitting cross-legged in the back of the van with her laptop perched on a crate of donated bread. And through it all, Julian was there. Not always in the foreground, but always close, checking in after a long day, sending her articles he thought she'd find useful, showing up with a ridiculous sandwich when she forgot to eat. Their connection deepened in the quietest, realest way. There was no rush, no grand declarations, just steady presence. Consistency. One night, after a community dinner they helped organize, they found themselves walking through the neighborhood as the sun dipped behind the skyline, painting the city in warm gold. They shared stories, both of them a little tired but content, as they passed a mural painted by one of the teens from the shelter, a vibrant explosion of color and hope. Grace looked over at Julian and realized that she wasn't just building something with him. She was becoming something beside him. Someone whole, someone seen. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the future. It was a Saturday afternoon, the sun high and generous, scattering warm light across the courtyard behind the community center. Grace had just finished overseeing a community luncheon hosted by the Ember line. A simple spread of vegetable stew, rolls, and sweet tea. But the atmosphere was far from simple. Children chased each other between folding chairs. Volunteers laughed while breaking down tables, and a local guitarist strummed mellow notes in the background. Grace had been moving nonstop for hours, but now she finally allowed herself a breath, standing off to the side and letting the breeze lift her hair from her neck. Then she saw her. Sitting on a bench beneath the trees was a figure so familiar that Grace's breath caught in her throat. The wool shawl draped over the woman's shoulders was unmistakable. Grace blinked once, then again, and crossed the grass almost in disbelief. "Marta," she said, voice half wonder, half hold, it together. The older woman looked up, and her face bloomed into a warm, knowing smile. "Took you long enough." Grace laughed, a burst of pure joy, and knelt down beside the bench. "I've thought about you every day. I didn't know how to find you." "I didn't need to be found," Marta said, reaching out to pat her hand. "I knew where you'd show up, right where you belong." They sat in the dappled sunlight, catching up like long-lost friends. Grace filling her in on the Ember line, the foundation, the strange, beautiful path that had led her from that cold bench in the park to today. Marta listened with that same quiet attentiveness Grace remembered from the very first time they met, nodding, eyes twinkling with each story. Then she chuckled softly and squeezed Grace's hand. "I hoped you'd find your way to him." Grace tilted her head. "To who?" "To Julian," Marta said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Grace blinked. "Wait, you know Julian?" Marta gave her a mischievous smile. "Should. He's my son." The world tilted slightly. Grace stared. You sent me to Clarice. You gave me that sandwich. You knew what I needed. And then..." She trailed off, trying to process it all. "All this time..." Marta nodded slowly. "He told me about the girl who gave him $10 when he had nothing. I had to meet her. And when I did, I saw what he saw. Someone whose heart was too big to be ignored." Grace sat back, stunned. "So, you, what, planned all of this?" Marta chuckled. "Not planned. Nudged." Grace looked down at her hands, feeling the past and the present folding into each other, like two pages finally sewn together. She thought of the sandwich in the park, the way Marta had handed it to her without judgment, the way Julian had returned with that same quiet compassion in his eyes. Everything had been connected. Every moment, every choice. A constellation she hadn't seen until now. That night, after the tables had been cleared and the sun had slipped behind the rooftops, Grace sat beside Julian on the rooftop garden of the Foundations building. The city sparkled beneath them. The city sparkled beneath them like a bed of stars, and the air buzzed softly with spring. She told him everything, about Marta, the sandwich, the realization that their paths had been crossing long before they ever really met. Julian didn't speak for a long time. He just sat there listening, his fingers loosely intertwined with hers. "I used to think fate was just coincidence," he said finally. "Something we gave meaning to after the fact. But meeting you..." He turned to look at her. "It changed that." Grace looked at him, really looked, and something shifted inside her. The weight she'd carried for so long, The losses, the hunger, the doubt began to feel like roots instead of chains, like everything she'd endured had led her here, to this rooftop, to this boy she once met in the rain, to a version of herself she had never dared to imagine. She squeezed his hand. Maybe everything that broke me was just clearing space, so I could finally be whole. Julian smiled, leaning in just enough for his forehead to rest gently against hers. You were never broken, Grace. Just waiting for the right season to grow. And in that moment, under a sky that had once felt so far away, she finally believed him. The community garden downtown was alive with the vibrant energy of early spring. Sunlight spilling over rows of budding vegetables, children darting between wheelbarrows, and volunteers chatting as they sorted seed packets. Grace walked alongside Julian down one of the gravel paths, her boots crunching softly with each step. It had been a full morning. The Ember line had just partnered with the local shelter to launch a job training program that included gardening, meal prep, and basic income budgeting. It was small, but already lives were changing. Grace could feel it in every handshake, every name remembered. Julian had been quiet all afternoon, though, not distant, just thoughtful. There was a calm sort of focus in his eyes, and Grace knew him well enough now to recognize when he was working something out in his head. They reached a quiet corner of the garden, beneath a magnolia tree just beginning to bloom. Its soft pink petals fluttered in the breeze, like confetti from some secret celebration. Julian stopped walking, his hands tucked in his coat pockets, gaze fixed on the horizon for a moment before turning to face her. I've been offered a new opportunity, he said gently. Grace's heart skipped. Okay. He took a breath. The foundation's expanding. They're opening a satellite office in New York. Urban Outreach Initiative. It's big, Grace. The kind of reach we've dreamed about. They want me to lead it. She nodded slowly, processing his words. That sounds amazing. I mean... Julian looked at her carefully, his voice soft. But I told them I wouldn't go unless I could make you the same offer. Grace blinked. You want me to go with you? I do, he said. To help lead the next phase of Ember. We'd be building on everything you started here. Scaling it. Expanding it. You'd be at the helm. She stood there in the soft sway of blossoms, stunned. The idea of leaving this city, this foundation, this garden, the people who'd lifted her out of the dark, felt like yanking a thread from her soul. But the chance to grow what she had built, to reach even more people. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved slowly across the garden. There, a young woman she'd mentored during her second week volunteering was helping an elderly man sort seeds by hand. Another volunteer knelt nearby, laughing with a child who once refused to speak to anyone. These weren't just colleagues. They were her community, her roots. I don't know, she said finally, her voice gentle. I love what we're doing here. These people, they were the first to believe in me. I feel like I still have more to give them. Julian nodded, not with disappointment, but with understanding. I thought you might feel that way. I'm not saying no, she added quickly. I'm just not ready to leave, not yet. He smiled then, that quiet, unshakable smile of his. That's why I admire you, you know. You stay where it matters most. They found a bench and sat together, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them. A soft wind rustled through the garden, and the world kept moving around them. Alive, real, full of stories and second chances. I guess this is the part where the road splits, Grace said after a while. Maybe, Julian replied, but only geographically. She turned to him, eyes searching. You think we can make that work? I think we already have, he said. You and me. We're not just bound by location. We're bound by what we believe in, what we've been through. And we'll keep building. Different cities, maybe, but always together in some way. Grace exhaled slowly, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. You're going to do incredible things there. So are you, he said. Here. They made a plan. Julian would move to New York in the fall. Grace would continue running the Ember line in the city they both loved. They'd check in weekly, share notes, combine projects where they could. Visits, video calls, late-night texts. It wasn't goodbye, it was evolution. As they stood beneath the magnolia tree again, petals falling softly around them, Grace knew one thing with clarity. She wasn't losing him. They were simply planting seeds in different soil, both growing in their own ways, but from the same root of kindness, trust, and a single, shared beginning. 1 year later, the city looked different. Or maybe it was Grace who had changed. The cracked sidewalks no longer felt like traps waiting to break her stride. The towering buildings no longer loomed. They watched silently, like old friends who had seen her at her worst, and now stood back, letting her rise. The Ember line had grown into something far bigger than she had ever imagined. The single van had become 3, each covering its own route through neighborhoods often overlooked, forgotten. They served more than 2,000 meals a week now, not just food, but hope in the form of warm greetings, clean socks, quiet conversations, and resource cards printed with dignity. Grace had built a volunteer network that ran like a living, breathing organism. Fluid, adaptive, compassionate. The mobile kitchens had become moving anchors for people who thought they had nowhere to tether their lives. And that wasn't all. With the help of the city, the Westbridge Foundation, and a few persistent grant writers, including herself, to her own surprise, Grace had opened the doors to a full-scale support center just 3 months ago. The new building stood proud on the edge of the East District, transformed from an abandoned library into a place where people could truly begin again. Showers, mental health counseling, job training, meals, art therapy. It had everything she once needed and couldn't find. The day she was handed the keys, her hands trembled. But every morning since, she arrived before sunrise, tied on her apron, and welcomed early guests by name. Because no matter how large the work had grown, Grace refused to forget what it had started with: a single $10 bill, and a decision to believe in someone who didn't look like much, but held a whole world waiting behind his tired eyes. Now, on the anniversary of the Ember Line's founding, the staff had organized a celebration. It was their idea, not hers, which made it even more meaningful. There were balloons, laughter, and a long banner that stretched across the main hall. 1 year of open hands. A clothesline was strung along one wall, filled with photos, snapshots of smiling faces, paper bowls being passed through van windows, hand-drawn thank you notes from children and seniors alike. Grace had spent the afternoon in back-to-back meetings with city leaders about expanding their grant. She arrived late to the celebration, still wearing her blazer from the meeting and a little wind blown from her rushed walk. As she stepped into the room, her eyes scanned the crowd, her heart full. And then she saw him. Julian stood near the serving table, holding a bouquet of wildflowers in one hand and something small and square in the other. His eyes found hers across the room, and everything else faded into a quiet hush. He looked older somehow, more grounded, more at home in himself. She hadn't seen him in person for almost 2 months. Their schedules had clashed, their calls often squeezed between late nights and early mornings, but their bond had never wavered. He crossed the room with purpose, a soft smile curving on his lips. "Hi," he said. Grace laughed through the tears rising to her eyes. "You came back." "Told you I would," he said gently. The room began to quiet as people noticed them. something in the air, shifting like a held breath. Julian reached into his coat and pulled out a crisp, unfolded $10 bill. He held it up between them. "I've been carrying this for a year," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Not because I needed to pay you back, but because I needed to remember the moment that changed everything." Then he opened the small velvet box in his other hand. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, unmistakably hers. "You gave me something no amount of money could ever buy. Faith. When I had nothing to show for myself. Let me spend the rest of my life proving you were right." Grace's eyes blurred with tears. The memory of who she had once been, the girl on the platform, clutching her last bill in trembling hands, flashed before her like a distant echo. And now, here she was. Here they were. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with joy. "Yes." The room erupted in applause, but she barely heard it. All she could feel was his hand in hers, the rhythm of his heartbeat syncing with her own. Later, as they stood beneath the twinkling lights strung above the courtyard, watching the guests they helped dance and laugh and reclaim joy, Grace pulled the $10 bill from her pocket one last time. She held it up to the light and smiled. "A little kindness," she said aloud, "can be the beginning of a miracle." And she knew, deep in her bones, in her heart, in the breath she took next, that hers had only just begun. The story of Grace and Julian reminds us that even the smallest act of kindness can carry unimaginable weight. A single moment, a $10 bill, a gesture of faith, can ripple through time and transform not just one life, but many. Grace didn't help Julian because she expected anything in return. She did it because something deep inside her still believed in people, even when life had stripped everything else away. And it was that belief, that spark of compassion, that led her to discover her own strength, her purpose, and ultimately, her place in the world. This story is about more than just resilience. It's about the power of human connection, about how trust, once freely given, can become the foundation for second chances. It reminds us that people are not defined by where they start, but by how they rise. Grace rose not because someone saved her, but because someone saw her. And then she learned to see others, and to carry that vision forward. So wherever you are in your journey, whether you're the one giving, receiving, or still waiting in the between, remember this: what feels small to you might be life, changing to someone else. Never underestimate the power of your story or your kindness. If this story moved you, we'd love to know. What was your favorite part? Or what moment resonated with your own life? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more real-life narratives that uplift, inspire, and remind you that your story matters too. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and keep believing in miracles, even the quiet ones.